All right, good morning. My name is Jared Bruder. I'm the Executive Director of the South Carolina Sheriff's Association. We are here to host the non-ferrous metals training, curtailing catalytic converter theft. We'll be going over several different changes in the law that happened this year in the legislature. I do want to go ahead and acknowledge we've got, I see 108 attendees that are online right now. All the attendees are automatically muted on that side. I'll explain a little bit about asking questions, but we have, I believe, about 130 people registered, so some will continue to trickle in. Some may come and go, and obviously this may be getting shared in squad rooms or other places throughout the state. But we also have a mixture of law enforcement and secondary metals recyclers out there, which is very, I guess, symbolic of the effort that we've had in this legislative process as well, for folks to work together collaboratively to make sure that this catalytic converter theft issue goes away. But I do want to recognize a few folks before we actually get into the presentation of everything, and that will kick us off after that. But our host, obviously, I'm Jared Bruder, Executive Director of the South Carolina Sheriff's Association. We've been working very closely with the South Carolina Recyclers Association, Barry Wolf, and others, and ISRI, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, and the South Carolina Police Chiefs Association, and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Officers Association. So we absolutely thank all of them for their participation in this and helping us get to the point where we can host this webinar today. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge some of the legislators that were very key in getting us to this process. So Senator Brad Hutto in the South Carolina Senate, representing the Orangeburg area, and others. He was huge in helping this come to fruition in such a quick time. Representative Todd Rutherford, Representative Chris Wooten, Representative Bill Sandifer, they were all huge in helping us get that push through the House and getting things done on that side. And as well, honestly, Sheriff Leon Lott here with Richland County, he, I guess you could call it an unholy union, matched up with Representative Todd Rutherford. When they recognized the problem, they came together and tried to address it together. So we thank him. We thank Steve and Barry, the Recyclers Association, for all they've done to help us get to this point where we do have a new law that we can talk about. So real quickly, housekeeping. After I get done here, I will be quiet and the experts will speak. But we will have a time for Q&A towards the end. So we will walk through the secondary metals recyclers training first, and then we will jump into the law enforcement training after that. I think it'd be important for y'all to hear both sides of that. And then we will conclude with a question and answer period and closing remarks towards the very end. But you will have an option at the bottom of your screen for a Q&A. You can send a Q&A directly to a panelist or me or the entire group. Or you can do something through the chat box. You can send chats as well. When we get to the Q&A portion, or if you have a question that absolutely needs to be asked at that time, you can also raise your hand, and I can acknowledge you and give you the ability to speak on your end. We would not see you, but we would hear you. But we would be able to answer questions through that mechanism as well. I will say this. Having drafted a lot of these questions or heard a lot of these questions, if you will be patient, you will probably have a lot of your questions answered through the presentation process. So I know that everybody has questions, but if you will go ahead and maybe even so you don't forget it, go ahead and type it into the question and answer box. You can submit it if you like to. And then we can kind of ask questions as we go, or we can ask questions all together at the end if your questions have not been answered yet. So with that, I'm ready to turn it over to Steve Levitan with Pull Apart. And am I going to Barry first? Okay, go ahead, Barry. You can unmute yourself and you can go from there.
All right, Jared, first of all, I want to thank Jared for putting this together, and everybody that has been working on this for the last several months since the law launched. From the recession of 2008 until January of 2011, the COMEX copper prices went from $1.29 to $4.58. Copper theft from farms, churches, buildings under construction, new, old, became a huge problem. It was a crime of opportunity. H 3660 passed and went into effect in August of 2011. Made copper transactions as well as transactions of catalytic converters, beer kegs payable by check only. It also created the permit to transport and sell and the permit to purchase as a secondary metals recycler. And we'll be going over discussing those documents today during this presentation. One of the unfortunate unintended consequences of that law was that the secondary metals recyclers were writing checks for 50 cents and 80 cents and 70 cents. And those checks were getting washed and ended up being cashed for $700-800. It was a problem for several years until 2014. Copper prices stayed above $3 through 2014. And while copper theft in general had slowed, the theft of air conditioner coils had become another hot spot. Churches that were unoccupied basically all week, we became the main victim of those crimes, as well as homes and construction sites. S 561 was passed, which set guidelines for who could sell a coil. It also gave us the ability to pay $25 in cash for copper, which shut off a lot of that check washing problem. But when we passed 561, if you look at what we did, it was really a common sense thing. It was who should have a coil. An air conditioning guy, a homeowner who swapped out a unit and had a receipt for it. But it was really common sense. Just as the spike in copper prices caused the issue in 2011, the spike in precious metals prices the precious metals found in catalytic converters has caused the problem that we're seeing today. The illegal buyers were everywhere. Facebook, parking lots. It's once again a crime of opportunity. This year, 3991, H 3991 was passed, and that's why we're here today. In the end, as we go through this, you will see it's not unlike the coil law we passed. It's a matter of who should have a catalytic converter. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Levitan for the recycler's perspective.
Thanks, Barry. Here we go. And Jared, if you could roll through the first couple of slides. And of course, we've all seen these headlines all around the state and frankly, all around the country. And before we get into this, I too would like to thank the South Carolina Sheriff's Association for hosting this webinar and all of the stakeholders that worked on this legislation. It was a great collaborative effort and to help develop the legislation and to pass the legislation. And again, particularly South Carolina Sheriff's Association, SLED, and thanks again to Senator Hutto and Representative Rutherford and the staff of both the House and Senate committees that worked on this. It was a heavy lift, and it got done, and we appreciate that. Go to the next slide, please. So again, we're going to answer a number of questions as we go through this today, both in my presentation and Joanna's presentation. What were the changes? How does that affect who can buy, who can sell catalytic converters? And what are the impacts as a result of that? Next, please. And next. So a couple of things to note before we get into this. First of all, this law is only dealing with detached catalytic converters that have been removed from an automobile, not a catalytic converter that's still attached to an end-of-life or scrap vehicle that's being sold either to a secondary metals recycler or to a demolisher. There's also a provision in the statute, just for clarification, in very rare instances, there are used catalytic converters that can be resold and reused, but only if they've been tested, labeled, and certified in accordance with some fairly strict US EPA Clean Air Act regulations. And then they have to be reported semi-annually to the EPA. So again, it does not happen often, but it can happen. That is not, those converters are not subject to this law. So what, as Barry pointed out, this was based predominantly on what we had done several years ago, dealing with air conditioning coils. And we clarified in this who can buy detached catalytic converters, who can possess and sell catalytic converters. And one additional change is we limit the location for those transactions. Next, please. So who can buy? Only a permitted secondary metals recycler may buy detached catalytic converters. You might ask why, why is that? Well, that's always been the case. Catalytic converters have always been covered in 1617 680. And it's interesting, we've heard some suggest that by doing that, that was done in an effort to create a monopoly for the purchase of catalytic converters. And, it's just a false assertion. Anyone who meets the statutory requirements to become a secondary metals recycler and to get that permit can do so and purchase catalytic converters in accordance with the statutes. Some things to keep in mind. We hear a lot of times people claiming that they're not secondary metals recyclers, and they don't need to be because they're a core buyer and they're buying cores. Well, no. Catalytic converters are not rebuilt. They're not remanufactured. Their value is the value based on the scrap, the platinum, palladium, and rhodium that are contained within those catalytic converters. And again, you can't take a catalytic converter off of a vehicle and install it on another vehicle legally under federal law. So unless they go through that fairly complicated process, they can't be sold for reuse. So again, core buyers, no. Along those lines, you may run into a situation where there's a core charge associated with a replacement catalytic converter. If you go to an auto parts store, purchase an aftermarket catalytic converter, They may charge you a core charge because of the value of the metals that are in that catalytic converter. They want to get the old one back. So there may be a core charge, but that's again only for the return of a catalytic converter and on a one-for-one basis. So that's not a purchase transaction. It actually becomes a refund of that charge that was put on there. Jared, next, please. So again, on the subject of cores, you're going to see a lot of this. If you take a look on Facebook, go to Facebook Marketplace and just type in catalytic converter buyers. And this is what you're going to see. And again, very often they claim to be buying cores. Next, please. This guy purports to be a legitimate catalytic converter buyer out of the trunk of his car. Next, please. So we've heard a lot of questions in terms of who can buy. What about an out-of-state buyer? And it's specifically addressed in the statute. And an out-of-state secondary metals recycler can purchase catalytic converters in South Carolina. They have to show that they maintain a fixed site somewhere. And they have to comply with all of the other provisions of the chapter. And then they're allowed to buy catalytic converters. Next. This is not a new requirement. Out-of-state buyers have always been required to obtain a permit from the sheriff in each county in which they buy. So again, that's not something that's new. What has been added is that you have to have a fixed site. So again, an itinerant buyer coming in from out of state, maybe one of those guys' cars that we just saw, would not qualify. And again, all of the other requirements that a in-state secondary metals recycler has to meet have to be met by an out-of-state. So that includes a copy of the photo ID, taking a photograph of the seller, tag number, date of the purchase, the amount paid. Records have to be retained. No cash purchases over $25. Aren't many catalytic converters getting bought for less than $25. And then the same restrictions apply for the seller, and we'll get into that in a minute, but the seller has to meet all of the requirements selling to an out-of-state recycler as they would for an in-state. Next, please. So again, another social media posting. Trunk of his car, cat dad wants to buy your catalytic converters, and seems to have been doing pretty good for 2 days. Next, please. And of course, this one's the classic. Every catalytic converter buyer should have a racing jack and Sawzall in the back of their car too. So next, please. So who can possess or sell a catalytic converter? The possession part, again, is something that we heard from law enforcement, not just in South Carolina, but in a number of other states, that restricting possession gives an additional option as you're investigating or as you make a stop. So again, similar to what we did with air conditioning coils, there are only a certain number of limited businesses that should logically, legitimately have possession and be selling catalytic converters. Obviously, an automotive repair service, a licensed demolisher, auto dismantler, auto recycler, a licensed secondary metals recycler, a motor vehicle dealer, or a distributor of catalytic converters, new or aftermarket. Or another business that provides a record of the repair order, the date of the repair, and the VIN number, where those are applicable. The VIN number is always going to be applicable. So those are the limited circumstances for a business. There's another category, next please, and that's an individual. It's rare, but an individual may have a catalytic converter that they've swapped out on their vehicle, or that they've removed from their vehicle. And they can sell and possess a catalytic converter, but they have to have all of this information: the name of the person or company that removed the catalytic converter, name of the person for whom the work was completed, and that can be themselves. You know, they can do that themselves. It doesn't have to be a third party. They have to have the make and model of the vehicle. They've got to have the VIN number, the part number or other identifying numbers on the catalytic converter, and probably most importantly, a certificate of title or registration showing the seller's ownership interest. If they don't own the vehicle, if they don't have an ownership interest in that vehicle, they shouldn't have the catalytic converter for that vehicle. Next, please. So the transaction location, this is another change in the law, and transaction must take place at the secondary metals recycler's fixed site, or the secondary metals recycler can purchase those catalytic converters at the seller's site only if the seller is a licensed auto repair service, licensed demolisher, secondary metals recycler, or a motor vehicle dealer. And the presentation of that license is, again, critical for that seller to be able to show that that they qualify under those terms. Any other type of transaction with a different business or an individual must take place at the recycler's fixed site. So what are the responsibilities of the secondary metals recycler? First of all, the recycler has to make the determination of the qualifications of the seller and determine, is that seller one of those specified types of businesses, or are they an individual? And if they're a different type of business not listed there, they would be treated again as an individual. Next, please. So again, fairly simple at this point. Does the business or individual meet the qualifications and have all of the required documentation? If yes, we make the transaction can proceed. If no, explain what the requirements are, but decline the purchase. And included in the documentation, one of the requirements is that that seller must also, under South Carolina law, have a permit for transport and sale of non-ferrous metals. So that's still a requirement related to catalytic converters. And so finally, the recycler has an obligation to verify that the person has acquired the catalytic converter legally and has the right to transfer it and sell it. But the law is clear that that verification is by the recycler obtaining the applicable documentation. So if the recycler gets all of the required documentation, makes copies of that, that includes the license to transport and sell, the business license if it's one of those business entities, and the other required documentation, you've met that obligation. And secondly, retain the documentation. And one of the additional pieces that we need to get is a notation of any obvious markings on used detached catalytic converters, such as paint, labels, or engravings that would aid in the identification of the catalytic converter. Next, please. So just a couple of things to look at. If the catalytic converter has been painted, that's something that we at Pull Apart do. Every one of our catalytic converters has fluorescent orange spray paint. And another thing to look for is if the catalytic converter has been cut with a shear, and you'll see the way the pipe has been crushed, and that's been done with a shear as opposed to a sawzall. That shear is a several $1,000s investment, and it's typically only used by an auto recycler or a scrap recycler in removing catalytic converters from end-of-life vehicles. So somebody driving down the street and you stop them and they've got a catalytic converter like this that's been cut with a shear, there's something probably wrong. Next, please. The other is engravings or other markings. So here are a couple of examples. The either engraved, and we're also recommending that if you engrave a catalytic converter on your vehicle, you also use some high temperature paint, again, to make it very visible to a potential thief that this one's been marked. The other approach that's being used in some places is a label that, in this case, the label is a high temperature label that goes directly on the catalytic converter. We would still recommend adding the spray paint, but this has a unique identifying number. It's got a QR code, and it goes into a database when these are affixed. So that's another approach to this that works. We in the recycling industry are working to get these marking programs in place around the country. We're looking, frankly, for partners in South Carolina to develop these programs, partners both in law enforcement as well as in the private sector. So car dealers, oil change locations, anyone that would normally have a vehicle up on a lift, while it's up there, it's easy to take a $20 engraving tool from Home Depot and engrave the last 6 of the or 8 of the VIN. So you've got a unique identifier at that point, and then you hit it with a little spray paint. It takes 2 minutes and may save someone's catalytic converter. And from an evidentiary standpoint, if somebody does steal that and somebody buys it, well, at that point, they knew or should have known that there was something wrong. And with that, I will turn it over to Joanna.
Thank you all very much. My name is Joanna McDuffie. I'm the General Counsel at the Richland County Sheriff's Department in Columbia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it from law enforcement's perspective and what officers can do and look for, and some kind of things to be aware of that are part of the new law. So the new law specifically is dealing with detached catalytic converters, or any non-ferrous part of that catalytic converter. But it's part of that whole, as Barry and Steve had talked about, the whole structure of non-ferrous metals. So the first change that was made in the law that applies to all non-ferrous metals that law enforcement needs to be aware of is in section G1. And I'm going to kind of jump around from the slides here for a minute, but that again applies to all non-ferrous metals, and it is talking about who can possess them and who can transport them. And so G1 used to say that it was unlawful to transport non-ferrous metals in a vehicle unless you had a valid permit to sell and transport those non-ferrous metals, or you can present a valid bill of sale. That was changed by Senator Hutto and wanted to address some of law enforcement's concerns. That section now says that it's unlawful to transport non-ferrous metals in a vehicle, or to simply have them in a person's possession. So this applies to all non-ferrous metals, not just catalytic converters. You cannot possess those non-ferrous metals unless you have a permit from the sheriff's office, or you can present a valid bill of sale for those non-ferrous metals. There is a caveat or exception if the law enforcement officer determines that one or more of the exemption applies, or that the non-ferrous metals are not stolen goods and are in the rightful possession, then law enforcement should not issue a citation for violation of that subsection. But what that means is that if you stop a car, you stop an individual walking down the street, they're carrying a catalytic converter, or they're carrying copper coils or any non-ferrous metal, they must have that permit or a valid bill of sale, unless they can prove to you or document to you in some way that they are the rightful or lawful owners of that. That is an arrestable offense. It carries a fine of $200 or not more than 30 days for a first offense. As law enforcement officers, we have a couple options. You can do nothing. You can arrest them for a violation of that subsection, or in theory, you could seize the property and allow them either to bring you documentation and return that property to them if they can show that it was in their rightful possession, or you can seize it as contraband and make that determination and then arrest on a warrant at a later date. But that again applies to all non-ferrous metals, not just catalytic converters. So I kind of wanted to start with that. Jared, if we could go to the next slide. So it is the responsibility of every sheriff in South Carolina to issue permits for both secondary metals recyclers and individuals to have permits dealing with non-ferrous metals. So there are new application forms that were done this year in response to this law, and all the sheriffs should have those. But those forms are a little bit more detailed than in the past, and spell out the law for the individuals and for the secondary metals recyclers. The sheriff of each county that's issuing permits has the duty to investigate the secondary metals recycler or the individual's background prior to issuing a permit to be sure that the person is qualified to issue a permit. So that's none of that has changed from the old law. And one of the requirements is that in terms of secondary metals recyclers, one of the caveats is that can they sufficiently demonstrate to the sheriff that their ability to comply with the provisions of this section of this law. So, that could be as simple as the sheriff having a working relationship with these companies and knowing that they're doing their best to comply with the law and not buy stolen goods. Or it could be, going through, the last 30 days of, their transactions and making sure that they have properly documented it as, required under the law. But sheriffs do have that ability to investigate the background of both the individual applying for a permit and the secondary metals recyclers. In terms of the secondary metals recyclers, those permits are valid for 2 years. And one of the things that we see here in Richland County, and I know happens across the state, is that it is not so much legitimate secondary metals recyclers who are buying stolen catalytic converters. It is, kind of, Facebook Marketplace, or someone who holds themselves out as being in, some sort of automotive industry, or a person who just does some work around their house and then buys these from transient people in the neighborhood who are stealing them off of cars. And it's those people that, we really need to investigate the background of and make sure that they are a secondary metals recycler before we issue that permit to buy. Secondary metals recyclers have to have a permit from each sheriff that they intend to purchase non-ferrous metals in that county. So each county in which they plan to operate, they would need to have a permit from that sheriff. An individual only has to have a permit from the county in which they reside, or they have a secondary residence. And unfortunately, there is no database that can be checked by sheriffs or secondary metals recyclers statewide for an individual's permit. And so that's kind of one of the things that maybe in the future could be addressed or dealt with. But there is no way to know if that person's permit had been suspended by the sheriff and not turned in, or things like that, if they present it to a secondary metals recycler. The same applies for an individual. The sheriff has the right to investigate the background of that person. Permits also have the right to be denied, suspended, or revoked if any time the sheriff discovers the application information is inaccurate, they don't comply with the permit requirements, or they are convicted of a non-ferrous metals violation. We go to the next slide.
Joanna, if we can ask a question or answer a question
Sure,
real
absolutely.
quickly. There was a question earlier about the requirement or the opportunity, I guess, to investigate an SMR's background and potentially, I guess, to also inspect records. How do you do that if they're out of state? Obviously, there are jurisdictional issues there. Can you speak to how that may be done in Richland County?
So if they're applying for a permit here in Richland County, and I know that this is more unique to Richland County and not applicable statewide. So in Richland County, number one, we would ask them for a copy of their business license, because any person who wants to conduct business in Richland County would need to be licensed to do so. So with that licensure, and with the application, we would have some sort of point of contact or something, someone to go and discuss this with and meet with. So they would also, assuming that they had transacted business here at some point in time, they are still responsible for keeping records as required by this section. So if they had ever bought a catalytic converter in Richland County in the past year, because that's how long they're required to keep those records for, we would ask to see documentation and ask them to provide that to us prior to the issuance of that license as part of the background investigation.
Okay, thank you very much. And to make sure everybody understands, again, that is something that is kind of unique to Richland County. I think there's only a handful of counties across the state that have a business license process in the county, but certainly the ability to investigate and inspect still is there in any of those counties. So thank you for answering that question. We'll go on to the next slide.
I will say too, on that, so we've been getting lots of questions from people who are purporting to be secondary metals recyclers. Lots of them are kind of just, individuals that are buying them off of Facebook or the street, or tow companies or things like that. We have been asking, you are holding yourselves out as a secondary metals recycler. You have said you are buying catalytic converters or non-ferrous metals, let us see this documentation. So this is what secondary metals recyclers are required to keep. So this is under the law before it was changed. So this is nothing new. This has been in effect for years. So any secondary metals recycler buying any non-ferrous metal, it was required and is still required to keep the date of purchase, the name and address of the seller, photocopy of ID, seller's copy of the permit to transport and sell, license plate of the vehicle if they drove in, weight, size, other description of the metals purchased, amount paid, and a signed statement by the seller saying they're the rightful owner. Those records must be maintained for 1 year from the date of purchase and open to inspection by law enforcement during business hours. So that wasn't changed. That's part of the old law. The new law added in some additional requirements. Jared, if you could skip two slides for me. Yeah, that one. So for an individual to sell to a secondary metals recycler, and this is the other information that has to be provided. The name, we've gone over the name of the company that removed it, the person for whom it was completed, the VIN number, make and model of the vehicle that it was removed from, and the certificate of title showing the seller's ownership interest in the vehicle. This information is required to be kept by or provided to the SMR and then kept by the SMR under the new law, as well as all that other information that we just discussed that's part of subsection D1. So it's also important to note for law enforcement that when I spoke earlier about the possession of non-ferrous metals, so if you stop a car and you see a copper coil, that person is required to have the permit or a valid bill of sale, and law enforcement can't arrest unless, if you think that they're the rightful owner or came by it lawfully. So it's important to note that for an individual or entity, and it's not just talking about sales, so this law makes it very clear that for a used detached catalytic converter, so not copper, not any other non-ferrous metals, but for these used detached catalytic converters, it is unlawful for an individual to possess, obtain, otherwise acquire, transport, or sell as used the detached catalytic converter or any non-ferrous part without a permit and without providing the following documentation to law enforcement and or a secondary metals recycler. So if you stop a car and the person has used detached catalytic converters, it is not lawful for them to possess that without providing all of this documentation to law enforcement. So that is unique to catalytic converters, and that is simply the possession. So if they're walking down the street, if they have them in a car, they must have a permit to transport, and they must provide you with all of this information. So it's not just when they sell it that they have to provide it, but it's when they possess it as well. If they don't have it and you think they came by it lawfully, you could seize the catalytic converter and allow you to bring them documentation, giving them the benefit of the doubt. But again, this is a criminal act and a criminal offense, and it has penalties for violation of these sections. It's, Jared, if you can go to the next one. It's also unlawful for a seller to provide any false, fraudulent, or counterfeit information or documentation as required, and that there's a penalty for that too. In terms of, criminalizing the purchase by secondary metals recyclers, we tried to make it as clear as you can in the law that it's not, if someone presents false or fraudulent information to a secondary metals recycler, unless it is so glaringly obvious that they should have known, they're not responsible or liable, or should they be charged under this section. Now, if the same person shows up every day with the same documentation on the same car saying that the same catalytic converter has been removed from the same car 5 times in a row, that's on the SMR. You kind of can't be that willfully ignorant. However, if unless it's glaring, the secondary metals recyclers, unless they knew or should have known, wouldn't be charged or shouldn't be charged under that subsection for buying something that either the person misrepresented or false or fraudulently altered documentation in order to sell that to a secondary metals recycler. This is the documentation that is required for an individual or entity to sell is a big change, and it is a hurdle that not many people or individuals can have. And so hopefully the goal was for that to cut down on the theft, making it harder to sell to a legitimate secondary metals recycler, which is again why stressing that the permitting process is so important, because if people who are not secondary metals recyclers or who are not legitimately running a secondary metals recycling business are getting these permits, then that is just going to perpetuate the ability for these stolen catalytic converters to be sold. The other thing that's important is that it limits, this law limits, and as Steve was saying earlier, the location where the stuff can be bought. For an individual to sell a catalytic converter, it can only be done, and Barry or Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but it can only be done at the secondary metals recyclers fixed site. The only place that they can purchase not at their fixed site would be from, as Steve had on the slide earlier, an automotive repair, a licensed automotive repair shop, things of that nature. So you cannot buy these on Facebook Marketplace. You cannot buy or sell these in someone's garage. You can't go to someone's house to pick them up for them and sell them. It can only be done at the SMR's fixed location if you are buying from an individual.
Joanna, do you want to answer a question now or take it later?
Yeah, let's go for it.
How about an individual who comes in to sell a converter and they have the vehicle financed, so the title is with the loan company? Can we purchase it with paperwork from the financial institution that provides the vehicle info with the individual info, provided they have a vehicle registration in their name, or do we decline the transaction?
I think that person has shown that they have an ownership interest in that vehicle, and I think that you can accept that transaction, would be my opinion, or that's what I would advise my officers that work at the sheriff's department on, that not to do anything on that transaction.
Okay. And we maybe we can circle back to Steve and Barry when we get to question and answer period and see if they know that, but I would imagine they're in agreement. So
I certainly agree, particularly if they've got the registration. It says specifically title or registration. So I think they'd be okay with that.
Okay. All right, back to you, Joanna.
Again, the as with any law, the goal of this is not to criminalize or penalize or make it harder for someone who it is their own lawful catalytic converter to be able to sell that. It's to criminalize people who are going into church parking lots and fleet lots and school buses and cutting these off and then trying to sell those. So I would always advise our officers to err on the side of caution, not to charge, make sure that we get that documentation, and then we can always go back with warrants or things like that at a later date. But again, Jared, if we can go to the second slide, 30, I think it is. One more. Oh, cute. One more, I think. There you go. So again, each unlawfully obtained, possessed, transported, used attached catalytic converter is a separate violation, and you could charge per converter. So restitution can also be ordered, and it is contraband subject to forfeiture under the law. So it is not lawful for them to possess them. You can seize these items with or without potentially those criminal charges. And then if documentation is provided to you, then you would need to, that it was lawfully acquired, then you would need to return those. We are encouraging everyone, to mark these catalytic converters. That includes secondary metals recyclers. We have had, catalytic converters stolen from secondary metals recyclers as well. So any markings, anything that makes it harder for someone to purchase these, we would encourage everyone, to do that to help law enforcement cut down on some of this problem. I think that's it on my end, unless I'm happy to answer any questions.
I was gonna say, not yet. I got one more question for you that came in. What is the proper procedure for law enforcement to dispose of converters?
I'm sorry, you broke up for a second. What is
the proper procedure for law enforcement to dispose of confiscated converters?
So again, it would depend on how you acquire it. So if it is, and again, that all kind of depends. If it is acquired as part of a criminal charge, then my advice would be that it needs to be retained until the disposition of that case is over. If that case is resolved, against the defendant, and they were found, for taking this catalytic converter or stealing the catalytic converter, obviously that property wouldn't be returned to them, and it is contraband. It would not be legal for them to possess, and then it would be disposed of through the agency's evidence and retention policy. If it is a person's property that could have been legitimately acquired, then it would either need to be returned to the person unless law enforcement could show that it was contraband, and then it would be subject to forfeiture under the law.
Okay. I've had another one come in, and I don't know if Joanna, you want to take this one, or you want to, anybody else can chime in. If an automotive repair shop and or muffler shop is in the county and has been in business for years, what can they provide to show that they are a business? They are not required to have a business license in this particular county. And that is apparently only 8 counties in the state require that. So I know that came up in the legislative process, but anybody want to chime in and talk about that?
So only 8 counties require business licenses, but lots of municipalities require them. So that they may be able to show a municipal business license as opposed to a county business license. I know that we have discussed that here. And granted that, it's my opinion, but, registration, with DOR showing that they're paying business licensing, filings with the Secretary of State showing some sort of incorporation, whether that, whatever form that takes. So some sort of filing with the state showing that number one, they're paying taxes on whatever, business they're doing, or that they've some way registered or incorporated to show that they are some sort of business. I think I would advise my officers not to charge if people could show that documentation.
Yeah, and again, Steve or Barry, y'all are welcome to chime in if you'd like to, but there were a lot of concerns at the State House about the proverbial muffler repair guy. And we're not trying to make business any more difficult for the small mom and pop operators, but anything that can really kind of indicate that you are working in that business, that you're not, doing those things in the back of your car, particularly. But I guess best faith effort would be appreciated.
I think what you have to. I think that common sense. I think that where there are issues that are not specifically, they've got to have a federal ID. There are things that people have to have, and I think we need to just make sure that we're exercising common sense in the whole thing.
Yeah, just as there are a number of different types of identification that can be used, I think we can look at this the same way, as long as there's some indicia of legitimate business engaged in one of those specific types of businesses. Jared, you raised a good point that we should address, and that is that there was one exemption put in dealing with the need for a permit to transport or sell. And that's for an automotive repair service. So an automotive repair service is specifically exempted from needing a permit to transport or sell if they have the documentation showing the repair number, who removed it, when, and the VIN number. So if they have those pieces of information, they would not be required to have a permit to transport or sell. But that's the one exemption that was put in there.
All right, I got another question, and again, we've kind of reached that point in the agenda where we're asking questions and answering questions of the panelists. So if you have a question, feel free to submit it in the Q&A or the chat, or if you like to ask it verbally, you can raise your hand and I can recognize you. Maybe easier to do it in the question and answer box though. But the next one up is, must those applying for SMRs that are residents of South Carolina have a fixed site somewhere within the state? Anybody?
So, I mean,
Well, the answer is yes.
Barry, isn't there a provision for a permit without a fixed site for in-state?
I don't believe so, but I will defer.
right, so I mean, a secondary metals recycler has to have that fixed site where, and they have to get a permit as an SMR where that fixed site is located. If they intend to purchase from places other than the fixed site, then they would need a SMR permit from a sheriff in each of those counties as well. But if their business was incorporated in, Georgia or something, there has to be a fixed site somewhere for that SMR. And so, the president could live in South Carolina but work in Georgia. That fixed site could be in Georgia. He would need to have a permit as an SMR in every county that they intended to buy non-ferrous metals in. But a fixed site has to be somewhere.
Yeah, I think if we're answering Barbara's question, the answer is if you have a fixed site in Charleston County, then you're fine as far as buying metals from other counties, or if you set containers in other counties. It's only if you do not have a fixed site. But if I have a location in another county, every county you have a location and you need to have a permit.
Yes.
We have locations in Berkeley County and locations in Charleston County and have permits in both counties, if that helps.
Yeah, and certainly with regards to catalytic converters, it's specific. You must have a fixed site.
We had another question come in. Towing companies that are not SMRs that want a permit, are they classified as fixed site and charge $200 or no charge as an individual?
So if the only SMRs can buy used detached catalytic converters, and only SMR permits are charged that $200, a towing company that wants to sell a catalytic converter would need an individual, so that the other permit is for an individual or an entity, and there's no charge for that, but they cannot be buying used detached catalytic converters in any way, shape, or form.
And if they're selling a catalytic converter, they're not one of those specified businesses. And they would have to show ownership of the vehicle from which the converter was taken. So just possession of that vehicle wouldn't meet the requirements. They've got to show registration, title, something that shows ownership of the vehicle.
All right. Another question was, do they need an SMR from the county in which their fixed site is located before we issue one in our county?
There's
I don't.
there's no timing,
Okay.
requirement under the law. They just need one from each. The SMR would need one from each county in which they either their fixed site is located or they intend to purchase. And I don't think it matters which county issues it first. But again, law enforcement should, work together and share information as possible, even though there's no registry or kind of, database to look in at this point.
Okay. When a business applies for an SMR, who is required to apply for the permit? Will any employee suffice, or should it be the owner or member of management?
Well, I think that will be explained, and I wish we had. Do we have the forms that we could put up? That would basically explain it all, because the forms, when you get your when you get your SMR permit, it's going to be a little more detailed than it was before, and it will be universal throughout the state. That's one of the things that I think will be a big help to law enforcement and to everybody that's everybody involved, that we'll all be looking at the same documents, and they will have part of what we have in the new document is the owner's information, and also you will have a point of contact for those secondary metals recyclers. So law enforcement will have a go-to guy at each of our facilities.
So up at the top in the blue line, you have this.
If you will give me just 1 second, I'm trying to pull up that document.
Thank you, Jerry.
Can you see everything clearly there?
Yes. I think if you could expand your, that's good. There you go.
So again, as Barry was saying, the secondary metals recyclers, the South Carolina Recyclers Association, the Sheriff's Association, as the statute calls for, collaborated with SLED to come up with this new permit process. So we will now have the same permit process. They've got fillable forms that should be at every county throughout the state now, both for SMRs and individuals. And they should all have a similar, or actually the exact same permits that are issued once they go through that process. But this is the information that is there. Again, 8 pages to go through this stuff, and this is for the business that is becoming an SMR.
And Jared, just for the most part, this should be for the majority of secondary metals recyclers, this should be a renewal year, because of the start date, which was 2011. So it should be a renewal year for most of the secondary metals recyclers, because most of them have been around since we started since the first go around.
Jared, do you know if this form is available online yet? Possibly on SLED's website?
I will check on that to see. I believe we've made it available on our website. If we have not, we will be. I think we also intended to share the flow chart that you came out with, that you developed. So we hope to be able to share that as well.
The form is available on the Richland County Sheriff's Department's website
Okay.
as well.
All right.
And that's another thing that we are doing. And I would encourage, sheriffs around the state that we have identified who we know to be secondary metals recyclers. We have sent them a letter saying that there's a new permitting process and how to apply for these permits, and encourage them, to do it within, I think, we said 30 days from the date, the letter was sent out, but also we are happy to, to meet with anyone and go over kind of the changes of the law and kind of what we're looking for and what we expect. And it's been beneficial so far in terms of, building those relationships so that if there is an issue in the future, we can kind of address it on the front end.
Yeah. And again, we have made it available on Sheriff's Association website. It's under the training tab. So if you want to check that out, you can go there and see that. Joseph Rich has asked to speak. He's raised his hand. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Rich and let him chat for a second.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay?
We got you. Yes, sir.
Okay. To answer the past two questions, the answer to the first question obviously is no. If they do not, the state does not provide a provision for someone to be a secondary metals recycler unless they have a fixed location due to the proviso that they must be open during business hours to physically inspect their records. So you cannot be an SMR unless you have a fixed location in the state of South Carolina. You could be an SMR from out of state, but you must have a fixed location there as well. So the second question, I think the answer is, should law enforcement issue a SMR to someone that has not been issued SMR yet in their state, in their county? The answer to that is no as well, because technically by the proviso of the law, if they don't have an SMR issued in the county from their fixed location yet, then they technically would not qualify to even be an SMR. So another county shouldn't issue them one until they have one from their fixed location county first. And then that would then codify them as a legal SMR. And then other counties could then begin to recognize them if they wanted to travel outside and get an SMR, a permit to purchase in other counties from there, which they would not need in accordance with the law, because if you're a fixed site SMR in one county, you're not required to have one in each individual county in the rest of the state that you're purchasing converters in, if my understanding is correct.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why he was integral in getting this law passed as well. Joe came up and gave great testimony in both the House and Senate. So thank you for contributing in on that.
I think Mr. Rich is completely correct about, in a perfect world, they would absolutely have one from the county in which their fixed site is located in. I know that some sheriff's departments haven't, and we have in Richland County have been guilty of this as well. We haven't been issuing those SMR permits, and now we kind of were waiting for the new law to get passed, and now that is we're reissuing it. So if their fixed site is in the county where permits are being issued and they don't have one, then that I think absolutely would be problematic. However, if they're in a county where the sheriff's office is slower to implement or is not implementing it, I think that's something that the subsequent or the other sheriff would need to look at in determining whether to issue that permit.
All right, what other questions are there? Okay, I just got one in. What criteria should sheriffs consider when determining whether to issue a permit to transport or sell? For example, could a permit be denied, suspended, or revoked if a background check reveals pending property offenses or convictions for property offenses?
And is the question in terms of an individual?
Yeah, I believe so, yes. Permit to transport or sell, yes.
So the law kind of only gives a few, in terms of an individual, that they, the conviction requirement is under the non-ferrous statute and not property crimes convictions. But again, part of the new application process for an individual is whether they intend to sell catalytic converters and where they intend to acquire those from. And so any false, fraudulent, or incorrect information on that application can be later used to suspend or revoke. But under the law, I don't think just a property crimes conviction would be prohibited from issuing a permit.
If they've been convicted
And
a violation of 1611-523 would disqualify them. And I have no idea what that is. Joanna?
I thought it actually, I actually thought it was I thought property crime was grounds for disqualification. But I'd have to go back and read the statute again.
Joanna, you're muted.
All right. We did have one that was typed in earlier that I jumped over in regards to showing the title or registration for the vehicle as proof of ownership of the vehicle. The converter was removed. How do you verify that converter was removed from that vehicle? And what prevents the seller from using the same title and registration at multiple scrapyards or on multiple transactions?
I would suggest if multiple scrapyards is certainly is going to be a problem until there's a way to flag a VIN for those transactions. You know, I mean it's as far as using the same title at the same scrapyard, I would or secondary metals recycler, I would say that I'd say would be a bad on the secondary metals recycler. I'd say that would be a violation. That would be a violation because they're not paying attention to the paperwork.
Yeah, if you've got the same guy coming in 3 times a week with the same title and different converters, once again, that should be a clue.
And then part of that would be on, law enforcement. If you're, going around and looking at different SMRs paperwork, for the last 30 days, and you see this one individual pop up on a couple of them, they've obviously submitted, fraudulent documentation to presumably all but one of them. That person's permit can be suspended or revoked. That person could be criminally charged, or you could send out something to SMR saying this person is selling stolen catalytic converters using the same VIN numbers, and put SMRs on notice as well, not to be buying potentially from that individual.
And to go back to another part of that question, how do we know that the converter matches the type of vehicle? And there are some folks that specialize in catalytic converters that may have that level of knowledge. There are a lot that don't. And this question came up connected to a bill that passed in Texas. And we're trying to track down, is there a comprehensive picture book, if you will, of converters that tie it back to a specific make and model? And so far, the answer has been no. So it's not as easy as, they're not stamped. And that's been one of the problems. There's no unique identifier that the manufacturers, the OEMs, are putting on catalytic converters that in any way tie back to the VIN number, the make, or the model. So, until that happens, that's going to be a a problem. And
We
again, that's
got
why
another, we got another question that came in. Since this change in the law, I've had several people wanting to establish themselves as SMRs. One individual was trying to conduct this business out of his home. Can a residence be considered a fixed site? He also only wants to purchase cats from other SMRs around the state. Is someone who only purchases cats from other SMRs considered an actual SMR?
if they're purchasing cats, then, within the state, I would say they would meet the definition of an SMR. They're paying compensation for consideration for a non-ferrous metal, specifically catalytic converters. And it says from a fixed location or otherwise. So that ties them into that definition.
And again, they would still be subject to the same requirements to collect the same information, take the same pictures and all those types of things. So if they can do that from their home, I guess that could, while I don't think that was necessarily anticipated in the statute, I don't know that it's prohibited by the statute either.
You might want to check zoning.
Yeah. If a business violates records provisions of the SMR sections, who should law enforcement make charges against? Individual employees or persons whose name is on the permit? Joanna, that might be one for you.
Yeah.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the question. It was,
If a business violates records provisions of the SMR section, who should law enforcement make charges against? The individual employee or the person whose name is on the permit?
so, I think, that depends on, again, the circumstances. Is it one transaction that they didn't, get the right paperwork on, or is it, a chronic pattern where no employee, is kind of, getting the paperwork on? I think, it depends. Again, I'm sorry, I wish I had a better answer, but I think it depends on the circumstances. So if you have the other 5 employees who are all doing it correct, and management has trained them and taught them, and you have another one who is not doing it correctly, presumably because they're taking in those catalytic converters, then maybe it would be more prudent to charge that individual employee rather than the owner or the manager of that. But I think it again would depend on the circumstances.
Okay. If we run it through NCIC, what purpose code and justification would we use?
It's purpose code E.
You broke up there a little bit.
It's purpose
What
code
was that?
E like elephant.
Okay. Purpose code E and justification.
We put metal permit background check.
Okay. What if there are no stampings or numbers on the converter? Will describing the physical of the cat work in place of the, or not really sure what that's in reference to, but potentially.
You broke up. I couldn't hear the question. I don't know if that was directed at me or not.
I guess to everybody, I'm not real sure. It said, what if there are no stampings or numbers on the converter while describing the physical features of the cat work in the place of the stampings or numbers? Yeah.
I would say yes.
Yeah, the requirement is for recording obvious markings, such as paint, labels, or engravings.
Okay. I think someone said that core buyers are not SMRs and do not qualify. Can be an SMR. The difference. What makes one budget and another one not. Anybody? Steve, I don't know if you're muted on your side, Steve.
Yeah, you were breaking up. We didn't get the question.
Well, it's.
I'm sorry.
Bridget's question.
Bridget? Okay.
Yeah. And I think what Steve said was that the law, that the law doesn't distinguish between that a fixed site can be a house or a a big brick and mortar facility that's a 8 or 12 acre facility. And I think we all kind of agree that that's something that wasn't anticipated in the law.
But again, the point is, if they're buying catalytic converters, they can't say, I'm a core buyer and I don't need to be an SMR. So that was the point I was trying to make. If they're buying a catalytic converter, the only way they can do that legally is to be a secondary metals recycler and follow all of the requirements that anybody else would have to.
In other words, a core buyer is a de facto cat buyer. That they are basically one and the same, and you would need to have the same requirements to purchase cores as you would to purchase cats.
If they're buying cores other than a catalytic converter, if they're buying brake drums to be rebuilt, steering sections, brake calipers, things like that are legitimate parts that are alternators, transmissions. That's a core buyer. If they buy catalytic converters, at that point they've crossed over that line and would need to get to be an SMR.
All right. I don't see a whole lot of others that we have not answered. Any questions necessary that we have not answered? So I guess I'll do last call. If anybody else has a last call for questions, let's get the question in. Otherwise, we will proceed in a minute to closing remarks. Okay, well, I think I don't see any hands raised or anything else, so we'll go back and I'll give the panelists an opportunity to do some final remarks, and then I'll close it down at the end. So Steve, you want to go first and offer any final remarks?
Sure. Just a couple of points I'd like to make is, first of all, there are between 10 and 15 million vehicles scrapped every year in the United States. Since 1974, each of those vehicles has had at least one catalytic converter, and nowadays multiple catalytic converters on those vehicles. So there's a legitimate market, a legitimate trade for between 15 and maybe 30 million catalytic converters every year. Certainly there are a lot that are stolen, but the amount stolen is a tiny fraction of that legitimate recycling market. So we need to keep that in mind as we move through this. Not every catalytic converter is stolen, but I think we've got some good indications of what to look for, and we've gone through a lot of those. The other point that I want to throw out there is there's a provision that was put into this where, again, it says it's unlawful for anyone other than a secondary metals recycler to purchase, and it says, or attempt to purchase used detached catalytic converters. Just a thought to throw out there is advertising for the purchase of a catalytic converter on Facebook without having the proper requirements. Is that attempting to purchase? Is that an additional way to maybe deal with those folks? That's where we're seeing, again, the biggest part of the problems. And again, I just want to thank once again, Sheriff's Association and everyone for participating. Thank you.
All right. Great point there. Barry Wolf, Recyclers Association.
Yeah,
Give you, last thoughts.
I think I want to thank you again, as Steve did. I want to thank the Sheriff's Association and everybody that has participated in this thing, this effort. And it's been, yeah, I think that we've answered some questions. I hope we've got if there are any other questions, I think anybody on this panel would be more than happy to take any calls or see, you know, if we can help, we're here. I think my biggest point, the one thing that I think we need to make sure we do is use and there's got to be common sense used, and there has to be due diligence by all the secondary metals recyclers. And it's, you know, it's the same as the 2014 law. Who should have one? And if they shouldn't have one, there's probably a problem there. But thank you, everybody, for your participation.
Joanna, I'll turn it over to you for any final thoughts.
Again, just thank you to everyone, especially Barry and Steve and Mr. Rich. You know, everyone working collaboratively hopefully can do make our best efforts to curtail the issue of you know, stolen catalytic converters. And if anyone ever needs anything, I'm happy to answer questions or available at any time.
All right. And I'm Eric had one final comment. Thank you for all for your time and contribution to make things better in our state. I appreciate that comment there. Again, just want to, I know that whenever we take time to identify specific people, we usually leave people out, but this has been, I guess, a labor of love, labor of necessity to try to get this stuff addressed. And I want to specifically thank Adam Whitsett at SLED, Bridget Lott at SLED, Frank Finch, Dan Barkus, Andrew Hayes, Joe Rich, everybody that's a panelist on this call. All of you have been great in working with this, trying to get that information out there so that we can all understand it and be on the same page together. Again, this is going to be, it has been recorded. We will be able to put it out there for people to be able to come back and view it later in the future. I'll get with a panelist to see if they have any objections to sharing the slides as well. We may put the slides out there too. And we were also working together to hopefully film a video where we're going to be able to go back and show some of those purchases actually being made and what is proper, what is not proper, what law enforcement should be looking for, what SMRs should be looking for. So we're not done with this effort in trying to train. We'll continue to do it into the future, but we have reached the 10:30 hour. And so with that, I will consider this adjourned, and thank you all so much for being with us today for this training. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.